Long before the tales of Persephone, before Orpheus dared the underworld, even before biblical accounts of life after death, there was Inanna. Her story, etched into clay tablets over 4,000 years ago, is the earliest surviving narrative of a descent into the realm of the dead. Originating from ancient Sumer, in what is now southern Iraq, the descent of Inanna is not merely a myth. It is a cosmic drama of power, vulnerability, and the eternal dance between life and death. Inanna, goddess of love, war, and fertility, was no minor deity. She ruled over both sensual pleasure and military conquest, symbols of generative and destructive forces in nature. Yet she wanted more. She desired to understand death, to face it not as an end, but as a domain to conquer or integrate. Her descent was not one of punishment, but of choice. That choice sets her apart in ancient literature. It is the decision to enter the unknown willingly, to be stripped of power, to be undone. What follows is a myth layered in ritual, poetic in structure, and psychologically profound. It is a story of cosmic balance, of pride humbled, and of love's price. Inanna's journey, though divine, reflects something deeply human, the need to confront what lies beneath, and to emerge transformed. Inanna, the radiant queen of heaven, stood at the height of her divine power. She was the goddess of love, war, fertility, and political authority, respected across the Sumerian pantheon and worshipped in temples that stretched from Uruk to Akkad. Draped in celestial robes and crowned with the horned tiara of the gods, she wielded the sacred Mi, the divine decrees that sustained civilization and cosmic order. Her presence brought both passion and chaos, and her temples were alive with song, incense, and ritual ecstasy. Yet despite all her earthly dominion and celestial grandeur, there stirred within her an unquenchable desire for more. Inanna was not content to remain only the goddess of life. She wanted to know what lay in the realm of death, the great below, ruled by her shadowy sister Ereshkigal. Why did death exist? What power lay buried in the silence beneath the earth? This was not a simple quest of curiosity, but a cosmic act of ambition. To descend into death while still alive was to challenge the ultimate boundary. And so the Queen of Heaven began to prepare herself, not for war, not for love, but for the one journey from which even gods did not return. Before setting foot on the path to the great below, Inanna made careful and deliberate preparations. This was no reckless plunge into darkness. It was a ritual act, layered with intention and mystery. She gathered the sacred emblems of her authority, adorning herself with 7 divine items. Each symbol carried cosmic weight: the Shugura crown upon her head, the golden necklace at her throat, the twin lapis earrings, her breastplate of radiance, the gold ring on her wrist, the royal robe that wrapped her body, and finally, the Mi, the tablets of sacred decree, clutched tightly in her hands. These were not accessories, but embodiments of her identity as Queen of Heaven. Yet even Inanna, bold and divine, understood the danger of her journey. She summoned her trusted servant, Ninshubur, and spoke soberly. If 3 days passed without word, Ninshubur was to go to the great gods, first to Enlil, then to Nanna, and finally to Enki, and plead for her release. These were not empty instructions. They were a contingency for death. As Inanna stood at the threshold of the underworld, her divine regalia gleamed with celestial power. But each item she wore would be demanded from her as toll. What she carried as her strength would soon become her sacrifice. The entrance to the great below was not a door, but a gauntlet, a sequence of 7 iron-bound gates, each demanding a toll from those who dared to enter. When Inanna arrived, the gatekeeper Neti was stunned. No living deity had ever requested passage. Yet Inanna was resolute. She came not as a thief in the night, but as a sovereign demanding entry. She claimed her purpose was to attend the funeral rites of Gugalana, the bull of heaven, Ereshkigal's consort, but this was only a pretext. The truth ran deeper. Inanna sought confrontation with death itself. Neti sent word to Ereshkigal, who, with clenched jaws and hidden fury, allowed her sister's passage on one condition. At each gate, a piece of Inanna's divine identity would be stripped away. And so it began. At the first gate, her crown was taken. At the second, her earrings. Then her necklace, her breastplate, her bracelets, her royal robe, and finally the sacred Mi. By the time Inanna passed the 7th gate, she was naked, defenseless, and no longer clothed in the majesty of heaven. She had crossed the veil not as a goddess, but as a soul, bare, silent, and exposed. The descent was no longer symbolic. She had entered death's dominion in truth. In the heart of the underworld, the atmosphere was thick with stillness. No joy, no song, only the gravity of eternal silence. Inanna, now stripped of all divine regalia, stood before the throne of Ereshkigal, her elder sister and sovereign of the great below. Ereshkigal was not merely ruler of the dead, she embodied the sorrow, rage, and isolation of death itself. Her face was twisted with pain and power, her eyes cold as obsidian. Unlike Inanna, whose rule inspired awe and celebration, Ereshkigal's domain knew only mourning and decay. There was no warm reunion between sisters. Ereshkigal received Inanna not with welcome, but with judgment. The 7 judges of the underworld, the Anunnaki, were summoned. They fixed upon Inanna the gaze of death, sharp, absolute, inescapable. Their verdict was swift, guilt. Not for a crime in the mortal sense, but for trespassing boundaries no god was meant to cross. She had come uninvited, cloaked in pride, into a realm not hers. They pronounced her fate, and it was final. Inanna was struck down. Her lifeless body hung on a hook like a piece of decaying meat. The Queen of Heaven had become carrion in the land of shadows. Death, the great leveler, had claimed even a goddess. Above, the world began to change. Without Inanna, passion waned, fertility ceased, and the very rhythms of life faltered. But in the deep stillness below, Ereshkigal let out a cry, not of victory, but of agony. For even the Queen of Death was not immune to pain. 3 days passed. Above the earth, the temples of Inanna fell silent. The wombs of animals closed, crops withered, lovers no longer reached for one another. Life, deprived of its spark, began to fade. True to her charge, Ninshubur acted. She donned sackcloth, dirtied her face, and wailed at the gates of the great gods. First to Enlil, who refused. Then to Nanna, who turned away. Only Enki, god of wisdom and the watery deep, heard her cry and responded, not with thunder, but with cunning. From the dirt beneath his fingernails, Enki fashioned 2 tiny beings, gala spirits not bound by the laws of the living or the dead. These creatures were genderless, nameless, and made for one purpose, to slip through the gates unnoticed and retrieve the goddess lost to death. Enki instructed them not to fight, not to argue, but to listen. When Ereshkigal cried out in pain, they echoed her suffering. When she groaned in grief, they groaned in sympathy. No flattery, only mirroring. Touched by their compassion, Ereshkigal offered them a gift. They asked only for the corpse on the hook. Inanna's body was delivered to them, but it was lifeless. The spirit sprinkled it with the food of life and water of life, ancient primal forces older than gods themselves. Breath returned to her lungs. Eyes opened. The Queen of Heaven lived again. But the underworld is not a place one leaves without consequence. As Inanna turned toward the gates, the gala demons rose, blocking her way. Her body lived, yes, but her freedom came with a price. One soul must take her place. The debt of death must be paid. Inanna's resurrection was not her triumph. It was a transaction. Though her body now stirred with breath, the laws of the underworld remained unbroken. No one escapes without ransom. The gala demons, born of shadow and duty, clung to her like smoke. Silent, tireless, without mercy, they followed her ascent through the 7 gates, back into the realm of light, demanding a soul in exchange. At each gate, as her garments and symbols were returned, Inanna's power returned with them, but the price weighed heavier. She could not simply reclaim the heavens and ignore the blood bargain struck in her revival. The underworld had marked her, and the gala would not be denied. As she rose, Inanna encountered figures who had mourned her absence. Ninshubur, loyal and grief-stricken, her sons and servants bent low in reverence. Yet one by one, she passed over them. Their loyalty, their sorrow, had shielded them from her wrath. She would not give death those who had honored her in life. But the journey was not yet complete. Inanna's eyes turned toward the palace, toward the throne that had remained warm in her absence. There, she would find the one who had not wept, the one who had not bowed, the one who now would pay. The Queen of Heaven had returned, but she was not the same goddess who had descended. She was reborn, and her justice would be severe. When Inanna returned to her throne in Uruk, it was not joy that greeted her, but indignation. Her absence had not broken her husband. Dumuzid, the shepherd king, reclined in splendor, draped in luxury, surrounded by attendants. He had made no offerings, shed no tears, sent no prayers. While the world had wilted in mourning, he had basked in her shadow. His comfort was her condemnation. Inanna's gaze fell cold upon him. She, who had hung lifeless in the dark, stripped bare and judged, now beheld a man who lived as if untouched by love or loss. Without a word, she pointed. The gala demons surged forward. Dumuzid's fate was sealed. Panicked, he fled. Through fields and rivers, across hills and cities, the demons pursued. He cried out to the sun god Utu, to his sister Inanna, but no god turned back death. At last, they caught him and dragged him to the underworld. His cries were not of injustice, but disbelief. He had not understood the cost of indifference. Yet all was not lost. Inanna, in anguish, offered herself in his place. Moved by her sacrifice, a compromise was struck. Each would spend half the year in the great below. And so the cycle was born, death and return, decay and bloom. Dumuzid's betrayal became the world's rhythm, his silence birthed seasons, his fall a cosmic lesson. Love unreciprocated becomes judgment. From the ashes of betrayal and the sorrow of sacrifice, a rhythm emerged, one that would bind the heavens, earth, and underworld in a sacred dance. With the compromise brokered between life and death, Dumuzid and his sister Inanna became the first to rotate through the underworld in turns. 6 months he would dwell among the dead, 6 months she would take his place. This divine exchange gave rise to the seasons, not as mere changes in weather, but as echoes of cosmic justice and restoration. Each year when Dumuzid descended, the world mourned with withering leaves and barren soil. His absence chilled the air and hushed the land. When he returned, the earth rejoiced. Blossoms burst, fields awakened, lovers stirred. Thus, the cycle of life and death was not an end, but a transformation. Inanna, once seeker of secrets, had become their revealer. Her descent and return had unveiled the boundaries between realms, the necessity of sacrifice, and the cost of ambition. She emerged not just as the Queen of Heaven, but as the mediator between what is born and what must die. Through her, humanity came to understand the fragile balance of existence. That death is not only loss, but transition. That love, when spurned, becomes judgment, but when honored, becomes redemption. And so the myth endures, not merely as a tale of gods, but as a mirror held to the mortal soul.